Blick of King's College, London, speaking on behalf of Tavarna e-Learning Institute for Iranian Civil Society. In the previous three talks, we have seen that while it is simple and universal in its fundamentals, democracy is complex and varied in its precise realization. Moreover, we have seen that the unfolding of democracy is an ongoing, sometimes tortuous process that has no end point. Given all this variability, continual change and context specificity, intense, sustained reflection carried out by people who understand the particular environment under consideration is of great value to appreciating the democratic performance of a particular state. It is also important to the promotion of democratic goals within that state. These characteristics motivate a series of key features of the state of democracy assessment framework methodology that we are considering as part of these talks. Resting on the two-pronged definition of democracy of political equality and popular control, takes a wide approach to this concept of democracy. It encompasses some of the more widely accepted features of democracy, such as elections, but also stretches beyond them to include characteristics potentially regarded as more tangential, but which in reality are vital parts of the democratic ecology. The method measures rather than simply judges the quality it considers in a binary sense. The questions are ones of degree, not absolute questions. Furthermore, while much use is made of quantitative data, ultimate judgments are qualitative rather than quantitative. They involve a discussion of merits in context rather than simply attaching a number or a grade to them. The methodology involves the consideration of historic data to establish development over time. Both progression and regression are possible, sometimes at the same time in different areas. For instance, in my own country, the United Kingdom, in recent years, there have been arguable improvements made in the dispersal of power from the centre, bringing democratic decision-making closer to the people through a process called devolution. Yet, at the same time, there has been centralisation in other ways, with the continual undermining of local government. Similarly, the Human Rights Act 1998 established greater protections for human rights than previously existed under our so-called unwritten constitution. Yet, some have criticised counter-terrorism measures introduced by successive governments in the period since the Human Rights Act was passed, on the grounds that they threaten some of the rights provided for in that same act. These tensions may seem insignificant from the perspective of countries governed arbitrarily and brutally and characterised by a complete absence of consistent protection for individual dignity and security. But as democracy as a concept and system is universal, so is the desire continuously to seek to perfect it. As we have seen, democracy is in the manifestation we recognise today, including provisions such as near universal suffrage, is a relatively recent phenomenon and has frequently proved fragile, even in countries imagined to be stable. To fail to continuously monitor democracy would be irresponsible for each of our countries and not fulfil a wider responsibility we have to contribute to the global cause of democracy. It might equally be argued that in countries suffering from prolonged and deep democratic flaws, there is little value in the continuous assessment of democracy to detect changes over time, since the outcome of any such assessment is likely to be that things were bad before and they've continued to be so. But, particularly if you apply the expansive range of democratic features incorporated into the state of democracy assessment methodology, the picture is often more nuanced than it tends to appear on the surface. The rule of law might have deteriorated, but socio-economic welfare might have improved. Multi-party elections might have been introduced, but corruption among public officials might have increased. Even if things are bad, or especially if things are bad, it is useful to know what we are working with. If there is an area of improvement, however marginal it might seem, it is important to identify why it has come about, possibly how to entrench it, and most valuable of all, how we might spread democratic improvement into other areas of that society. Even constancy in some features of a system is important to be aware of. It may even hold a key to understanding the stable underlying causes of a persistent dysfunction. All of the supposedly secure, mature democracies in the world today made a transition from something else at some point, or rather a long drawn out period in their pasts. While, as I've stressed, there is no one set pattern of democratic development, we now have the benefit of some historic examples from varied parts of the world that we did not once have access to. If a society is considered to suffer from deep deficiencies from a democratic perspective, is changing in a way that might be significant to its future, it's important that we can identify that this change is taking place, and using historic examples from other states that have made significant democratic process could help us begin to assess the value of this change. This international cross-comparison technique is, alongside the use of historic analysis, crucial to the state of democracy assessment methodology. Since democracy is at root universal, it is appropriate to carry out comparisons between different states as a means of gauging their democratic performance. But at the same time, given all the other features I've been stressing in these talks, the way in which democratic progress can be both slow and sporadic, its complex, multifaceted nature, and the varied ways in which it is realised in constitutional terms, a keen awareness of context is always important when we're carrying out these international comparisons. Let me expand upon this point. The State of Democracy Assessment Framework does not fit particular countries into simple categories. It does not use a binary approach, classifying them simply as democratic or undemocratic, or even a slightly more sophisticated model that allows for such definitions as emerging democracy, stable democracy, semi-democracy, and so on. The State of Democracy framework takes in a wide variety of criteria. At any given moment, the performance of a given state will vary across these different assessment measures. This richness of analysis is essential to fully appreciate democratic performance, but it does not lend itself to crude categorization or grading of overall democratic attainment. But to accept this model of democratic assessment should not lead us down a path to relativism. It is clear that some states are more democratically deficient than others, and by the same token that some have more democratic advantages than others. In some cases, a government may have no discernible interest in democratic values and be subject to little in the way of meaningful outside pressure to adhere to them. Or a conjunction of internal forces, such as civil conflict, may be so powerful as seriously to undermine even the most basic efforts at realising democratic principles. This observation is not intended to imply that we should ever assume circumstances to be permanently hopeless. But if comparing such states with, for instance, developed economies with stable constitutional systems and a long uninterrupted period of free multi-party elections, We should not do so in a way, we should do so in a way that recognises the differences, rather than ignoring the different order of difficulties involved, and we should not create a sense of futility on the part of the less fortunate state. In doing this, we may find that there are many useful points of comparison between states that nonetheless find themselves in decidedly different positions. For instance, my own country again, the United Kingdom, has experienced prolonged periods of violent conflict with deep historical, religious and ethnic roots involving the status of Northern Ireland, a province within the UK. The problems involved and the possible means of resolving such traumas may be similar to those found in other countries that on the surface seem to lack possible shared ground. It can be useful, therefore, to find a variety of possible comparators designed to accommodate a number of different characteristics. For instance, it might be deemed useful to group countries by level of economic development, by geographical region, by religious profile, by population size, or by historic legacy, for instance, if it is a former colony. As we have seen, many different constitutional models can potentially support democracy, but equally present their own challenges. It may be useful to compare a federal constitution with other federal constitutions, or parliamentary systems with other parliamentary systems, and those states with directly elected presidencies with the same. There are many different ways to approach the subject, and what is important is that those carrying out the assessment are aware both of the shared principles involved and of the particular context of the particular country being examined, a form of knowledge that those based within the territory itself are best able to provide. To carry out an assessment, we use a series of questions that are designed to tell us across a range of areas how well a given society is providing for the twin values of popular control and political equality, that between them are the essence of democracy in this methodology. Connecting these questions and the basic core principles are a set of what we term mediating values, the fulfilment of which is essential to democracy. They are, first, participation, which means people being able to take part and actually deciding to take part in democracy. Authorization, which involves the conferring of authority by the people on public office holders through free and fair elections. Then the methodology has the mediating value of representation, that is, democratic institutions reflecting the composition of the population as a whole. Next is accountability, in the sense of office holders being required to account for their actions to the people, as well as to institutions such as courts, parliaments, and through administrative justice mechanisms. Next is transparency, that is, openness to the public. Then we have responsiveness, which means public institutions being able to react to the needs of the public. Then finally we have solidarity, which means an acceptance of difference between people within a state and the promotion and supporting of democracy beyond the state internationally. The questions that comprise the State of Democracy assessment framework are intended to discern how well these key mediating values are being realised. They are measuring questions using phrases such as how far and to what extent. In each case, the question is structured positively. The greater the extent to which the country meets the criterion set out in the question, the more effectively it is performing democratically in that given area. It is possible to modify questions to make them more clearly applicable to a given country, and also to add extra questions if assessors see a need to probe a particular area in more depth. The content of the framework falls into 4 general categories or pillars. Pillar 1 deals with citizenship, law and rights. It commences with a section assessing the extent to which there is common consensus about citizenship free from discrimination. In this context, it asks how far citizenship encompasses everybody within the country, and it probes the extent of recognition of cultural distinctions within the state. The assessment also weighs the extent to which there is consensus regarding the borders of the state and its constitutional arrangements. Next, it considers the capacity of the system to manage serious divisions within the society and the existence of inclusive and impartial procedures for the alteration of the constitution. Finally, this part of Pillar 1 asks about the adherence of the government to international requirements in its policy towards people who are refugees or asylum seekers, and asks the extent to which they are protected from discriminatory treatment. The second section of Pillar 1 treats the rule of law and access to justice, asking whether these concepts are enforced fully and equally upon society as a whole, including upon public officials. The section commences with the issue of how far the rule of law applies throughout the entire state, then asks how far the holders of public offices are subject to the rule of law and subject also to clear, open regulations covering their activities. Then the independence of the judiciary and the courts as well from the executive and other forms of interference is considered. Next, the assessment moves to ask about the attainment of universal access to the law, its protection and due process from the law, followed by consideration of the adherence to fair treatment by criminal justice practitioners and by the prison system. The section concludes by asking about the extent of public confidence in the legal system. Do people actually believe it's going to work for them? Section 3 of Pillar 1 deals with civil and political rights, asking whether all people within the society are fully able to exercise them. It begins with the issue of basic human security, in particular protection from physical violation and the fear of such violation, a very fundamental right. It then moves to the freedoms of association, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly and freedom of expression, next to the freedoms of religion, language and cultural expression. Finally, it asks about groups and individuals who work to promote human rights and the extent to which they might be subject to persecution or threats. The fourth and final section of Pillar 1 considers economic and social rights, asking again whether all people have them equally provided for. It begins with consideration of the right of access to work or social security, followed by the issue of access to fundamental necessities of existence, such as water, food and shelter. The right to health across society and throughout life is then probed, followed by the right to education, including education about the role of citizens in society. The assessment then considers the right to organise in the workplace, in particular through trade union membership. Lastly, it measures the effectiveness and transparency of rules intended to regulate commercial corporations in order to best promote the public interest. Pillar 2 investigates representative and accountable government. Section 1 of this pillar asks whether elections provide people with control over the government and the policies it pursues. It considers the extent to which elections determine who holds public offices and how often there are changes in who holds those offices following elections. It asks how inclusive and accessible voting registration and elections are, and the degree of protection from interference in those elections by governments, parties and others. How fair the assessment then considers are registration processes for parties and candidates, and to what extent do they have equal access to media and other publicity outlets in order to enable them to make their case to the voters at election time. Further subjects of consideration for the assessment here are the degree to which the party and electoral systems provide voters with genuine choice between different options, and how equal each vote is, and how strong a relationship there is between the makeup of the executive and legislature and the way in which votes are cast. So this is very much about electoral systems and how they work. Finally, there is discussion of the representativeness of the social composition of the legislature, the turnout in elections, and the extent to which there is acceptance of the outcome of elections by all groups within the country, and also external observers of those elections. Do they accept the outcome as being fair and properly managed? Section 2 of Pillar 2 asks how far the party system serves to support democratic performance. It considers the freedom parties possess to organise, recruit, interact with members of the public and campaign for power. It investigates the effectiveness of the party system in establishing and in maintaining governments. Next, it asks about the importance of party members in the organisation and decisions of parties, and investigates whether parties are financed in a way which is conducive to the independence of those parties. Finally, it considers the effectiveness of parties in appealing to support across different divisions in societies, such as divisions over religion, ethnicity or language. Are parties able to actually straddle those social divisions in an effective way? Section 3 of Pillar 2 deals with effective and responsive government, and asks if government properly serves the people and provides for their needs. It considers whether elected governments are able to determine the issues that really matter to the people they are supposed to be serving, and if they actually possess the necessary resources and institutional capacity to perform these basic tasks. The assessment considers the control that elected office holders exercise over their officials and the different public bodies for which they are theoretically responsible, and whether these methods of control actually work, and also whether they are transparent, whether it's clear what is going on. The section then discusses how open, systematic and accessible are consultations on policy and law when the government asks people about its plans. How well does it really do that? How well does it actually involve the public in these decisions? The ability of the public to obtain access to official information is the next subject of consideration, to actually find out what's going on within government. And then there is an assessment of the confidence that the public have in the ability of government to deal with the issues that matters to it. So again, it's what do the people actually think? Do they believe the system's going to work for them? And whether they actually have confidence in their personal ability to influence that action that is so important to them. Section 4 of Pillar 2 deals with how democratically effective is the legislature or the parliament, and asking whether it contributes to the process of democracy. This section assesses the independence of the legislature or parliament from the executive and the freedom of expression of its members. Then it moves to look at its control over the legislative process, followed by the ability of this institution to oversee and hold to account the executive. The role of the legislature or parliament in approving and supervising taxes and expenditure, the public money, is the next topic of consideration. The assessment then considers the ability of all parties and groups to operate within the legislature or parliament, followed by a consideration of public access to the particular representatives that members of the public have. Can they actually get through to see the person who is supposed to be working for them? Finally, this section inquires into the capacity of the legislature or parliament to act as a focus for public debate. Section 5 of Pillar 2 considers civilian control of the police and of the armed forces. It addresses the question of how far the political and military spheres are separated from one another. Then it inquires into the extent of public accountability for the security forces and the police. The assessment then weighs the extent to which membership of the security services, police and army are representative of the composition of the wider society. Finally, it considers the issue of criminal organisations, warlords, private armies and paramilitary groups that may be operating within the territory, and whether they are a problem, and if so, how much of a problem they are. Section 6 of Pillar 2 considers integrity in public life. It begins by investigating the separation of the holding of public office from private gain. Then it assesses the measures in place to prevent bribery of holders of public office. The assessment then addresses the rules governing the financing of party politics and whether they discourage the subordination of democratic processes to particular interest groups. Is bribery taking over party politics, is the question being asked there. Assessors then consider corporations and business interests, asking how far their influence on government is restrained and how far they themselves are free from corruption, both domestically and abroad. Finally, the assessment asks how far people believe that public officials are free from corrupt practices. So as again, it's the public confidence issue. Do the people believe in the system working? Pillar 3 deals with civil society and popular participation. Section 1 in this pillar concerns the media, asking whether they are supportive of democracy. It considers their independence from government, how widely spread is their ownership, and the extent to which they are exempt from foreign or commercial influences. Next, the assessment asks how far the media express a range of different opinions and are accessible to various parts of society. How well do they and other organisations investigate government and business interests? Do journalists operate in a free environment, and at the same time are members of the public protected against inappropriately intrusive techniques on the part of the media? Section 2 of Pillar 3 asks whether the people play a full role in public life. It asks about the span of different civil society organisations and their separation from government. Then it considers the extent to which members of the public take part in the activities of these kinds of organisations. How fully do women take part in political activities and hold public offices? Finally, what is the degree of access to public office for different social groups? The third section of Pillar 3 involves the decentralisation of power, asking whether decisions are taken at a level which is most appropriate for those affected by them. It assesses the extent to which tiers of government below the highest level are genuinely independent from the highest level, and whether they have the necessary powers and finance to execute the tasks that fall to them. It then considers how far elections to these authorities are open to appropriate electoral processes and are accountable and responsive. Finally, the assessment investigates the extent to which local government works with relevant local groups in developing and delivering policies. The fourth and final pillar, democracy beyond the state, concerns the relationship with the outside. Section 1 discusses external influences upon the country. It asks how free the state is from outside influences that have a negative democratic impact, and examines the influence that various international and regional organisations have upon that state. Then it considers how far diplomacy conducted by the government is subject to oversight within the legislature and is also subject to public scrutiny. Section 2 of Pillar 4 assesses the external impact that the state has on democracy. It investigates the consistency of the government in promoting democracy and human rights externally, in supporting the United Nations and other international organisations, and in sustaining the international rule of law. The assessment considers the extent to which the government contributes to international development and the consistency with which it does so. Finally, the assessment asks how far external policy is subject to legislative or parliamentary oversight and is amenable to influence from the public. Those are the 4 pillars. So how do you actually go about answering all those questions? How do we go about carrying out, then producing an assessment in some form and promoting it? Well, when answering these questions, the starting point should be the official constitutional and legal position. In other words, assessors should consider the position that is supposed to be as it is supposed to be in strict legal terms and assess the merits of this formal framework. The next task is then to evaluate the practical position. Often today, many states appear, if taken at face value, to be committed to democratic principles, judged in terms of their treaty commitments and internal legal provisions and undertakings. But the reality on the ground may be very different. These rules may not be fairly applied, the institutional structures for ensuring their fulfilment might not be adequate, and so on. If there are difficulties with the formal position itself, it is important to know how they play out in practice. Finally, an assessment should seek relevant data pertaining to the fulfilment of each area under investigation. So we look for the data, the statistics, and other evidence. Where should the evidence used in an assessment actually come from? The first place to look, if possible, is evidence generated within the country concerned. Official reports and data sets, perhaps produced by government, by a legislature or parliament, or by other public institutions with some kind of monitoring role with democratic connotations, can be useful. Reports or literature produced by civil society organisations, academics, or journalists are often invaluable. However, it may be the case that circumstances in some countries, those with a pressing need for democratic improvement, mean that such sources are not as readily available or reliable as they might be in other countries. Here, the second source of information is important. A variety of regional and international organisations produce publications on aspects of democratic performance, enabling comparisons with other states and possibly consideration of change over time within given countries. The assessment also requires the establishment of means of measuring good practice. Good practice can come from outside, standards set by international organisations, or by comparisons with other countries. But better still, it is possible to generate it from within the country, for instance against the commitments the government has set for itself, or the opinions of the public as measured by quantitative and qualitative opinion research but this task may be difficult depending on the country that is involved. There is no set way to carry out an assessment. Generally, it is a good idea to have an oversight body of some kind to which a team of researchers work. The whole process should, if possible, start with a general meeting incorporating as many interested individuals and groups as possible to discuss the general issues. A similar gathering could take place at a later stage to consider a draft of the report or other output. Do not underestimate the scale of the task and build into it ample time not only for researching but also for writing up whatever the final product is. It is important not to let the totality become the enemy of specific achievement. In other words, you do not have to undertake a full assessment from beginning to end as a single task. You might choose to pick a particular pillar or group of questions in a different order to that in which they appear in the assessment. You may choose not to carry out a full assessment at all, preferring to carry out a selective themed study with a view possibly to carrying out a complete assessment at a later stage. Again, your knowledge of your capacity and your environment will be crucial here. Some tasks may simply not be possible, and some may be particularly urgent within a given specific context. What is important is that you do the best you can within that given context. Yet, while there is much flexibility in how precisely to go about an assessment, it is important to adhere to two principles. First, the exercise should be as broadly based as is possible. The people and groups you involve, for instance as members of a steering group for the project, should represent a diverse span as can be attained in terms of political opinions, different groups and professions, gender, ethnicity, and so on. If there are difficulties in establishing an expansive group, it is even more important to adhere to the next fundamental requirement. All the work must be impartial in approach. It should not be shaped by predetermined conclusions, nor should it service particular ideological ends. The project should be grounded in the widest possible range of evidence, with rigorous methodology deployed. Adhering to standards of inclusiveness and impartiality, far from blunting the potential impact of the assessment, sharpens it. An impartial, inclusive exercise is a more credible one, less vulnerable to attack as mounted in pursuit of a narrow agenda. But at the same time, the assessment is grounded in a clear value and has a definite purpose. It rests on the belief that democracy is good, and it is intended to help further this good. Therefore, an assessment should be conceived of as part of a process aimed at achieving this end. Building a steering group and holding launch events at the outset of the project and a further session to consider a draft are important staging points in preparing an audience for your output. The output itself can take the form of a full assessment or one or more thematic reports with supporting summaries and press releases. Often they are launched at events in the country concerned, but it is also possible to launch internationally depending on the most appropriate way forward. Electronic promotion alongside more traditional hard copy reports should be used extensively. The process can then continue with follow-up research and outputs, building a body of work and making it possible to trace how democracy is developing. The purpose is to contribute to the development of a democratic culture. It is unrealistic to expect rapid progress directly arising from the production of a particular report, but the development of democracy is unpredictable. Through assessments, we gain valuable knowledge about what is improving, what is static and what is deteriorating. Simply encouraging this kind of reflection can help prepare the ground for future moments of progress and increase the chances that, following a moment of progress that may occur in future, gains can be consolidated rather than reversed. Thank you.